He inherited an old rusty container filled with junk. Everyone laughed, convinced there was nothing inside. But when his dog started barking and digging in the corner, the man realized the container was hiding a secret that would change everything. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The northern woods stretched endlessly, a quilt of frost and silence that swallowed the sound of tires on gravel and the echo of human life. In that vastness of forgotten pines and weathered hills lived Thomas Gray, a man shaped by solitude and the patience of the hunt. His cabin stood a few miles from the nearest paved road, a small wooden structure that leaned slightly to one side after years of snow pressing on its roof. The air there always carried a hint of smoke, pine sap, and river fog. His only companion was a black Labrador named Rex, old but loyal, whose paws had left tracks through more seasons of hunting than most men could recall. Thomas had built his life on quiet repetition. He rose before dawn, made coffee thick as tar, loaded his shotgun, and disappeared into the woods until dusk. The silence of the trees, the rhythm of wind over branches, the crunch of snow under his boots, all of it had become the vocabulary of his days. He had no wife now, no family to speak of except a few distant cousins he hadn't seen in years. His world had narrowed to the stretch of forest around his home, the crackling of the fire at night, and the slow aging of both man and dog in a wilderness that neither judged nor forgave. It was on one such morning, while sorting through the week's mail at the kitchen table, that he found the letter that would change everything. The envelope was official, stamped with the seal of a county courthouse from a town he hadn't visited since he was a boy. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, and professional. Inside, a single page informed him that his uncle, John Gray, had passed away 3 weeks prior and had left behind property, a parcel of forest land deep within the northern boundary of the old timber district. Along with it, the letter mentioned, came a structure and its contents. The lawyer's tone was flat and legalistic, but the implication was simple. Thomas had inherited whatever John had left behind. He sat staring at the letter for a long time, trying to summon memories of the man. Uncle John had been a forest warden decades ago, a quiet and solitary figure not unlike Thomas himself. He had lived alone after his wife's death and rarely came to family gatherings. Thomas could only recall his scent of tobacco and pine resin, his weathered face, and the habit of speaking little but looking directly into a person's eyes when he did. It had been 20 years since they had last met, and back then, John had already seemed more a part of the forest than of society. Word of the inheritance spread quickly in the small nearby town when Thomas went to confirm it. The reaction was predictable, half amusement, half pity. The clerk at the county office laughed when she saw the old record. "That parcel? It's just a piece of useless dirt in a rusty shipping container. Been sitting there for years. No one even wanted it when the taxes went delinquent." Others told stories about the old man who used to guard the woods as if he owned them, muttering about companies cutting where they shouldn't, about trespassers and missing logs. To them, it was the inheritance of a fool, a box of rust and a patch of dying forest. But Thomas, listening to their talk, felt no embarrassment or disappointment. He wasn't a man who chased fortune or reputation. His life had been too long shaped by things others considered worthless: the silence of dawn, the loyalty of an old dog, the satisfaction of surviving winters that broke stronger men. He decided to see it for himself, if only out of respect for the man whose blood still ran in his veins. A man's last gesture, he thought, deserved at least to be witnessed. That evening, he prepared for the trip. He packed the truck with fuel, tools, rope, a lantern, and a thermos of black coffee. Rex watched in silence, understanding the signs of departure as he always did, his tail thumping once against the floor before curling back at his master's feet. The road ahead would be long. The location, according to the letter, lay 40 miles past the last maintained route, accessible only by an old forestry track that hadn't been used in decades. It was a journey few would bother to make for a container full of junk, but Thomas was not few. He had spent his life going where others would not, through marshes in the dead of winter, across streams under moonlight, deep into hollows where cell signals and human voices vanished. The morning he set out, frost clung to the truck's windshield like a film of silver. The engine groaned before catching, and the headlights sliced through a wall of fog. The dog settled on the passenger seat, his muzzle gray, and his eyes clouded with the kind of trust only age could give. They drove for hours along narrow, twisting roads that thinned from asphalt to gravel, from gravel to dirt, until the forest swallowed the world. Trees rose on both sides like dark walls, and the sky became a narrow strip of pale gray between branches. Every few miles, an abandoned shack or rusted sign marked the ghost of civilization. By midday, the track became little more than two ruts in the frozen ground. Fallen logs forced detours. The truck's suspension groaned under the strain. Thomas drove slowly, his hands steady on the wheel. The deeper he went, the more he felt the weight of silence. A silence not empty, but listening. The kind of stillness that seemed to hold memory. He reached the coordinates near dusk. The air was colder here, sharp and metallic, with the scent of old pine and water. At first he saw nothing but trees. Then as he rounded a bend, a shape emerged between the trunks, a rectangle of corroded metal half sunken into the ground. The container was the color of dried blood, streaked with rust and moss, its roof bowed slightly inward. The area around it was choked with weeds and young birches. A line of faint tire tracks, long since hardened by weather, ended at its doors. It looked less like a building and more like a grave marker for something forgotten. Thomas cut the engine and sat for a while, listening to the tick of cooling metal. He could feel the temperature dropping with the sun. In the fading light, the container seemed both fragile and indestructible, a relic that had outlasted purpose and memory alike. He stepped out, the crunch of frozen grass breaking the quiet. Rex followed, sniffing the ground, tail wagging uncertainly. The doors were locked, or had been once. The padlock was fused shut with rust, its shape barely distinguishable from the latch. He tugged at it, then gave up and circled the container. On one side, the metal was streaked with a pattern of scratches, as though someone had tried to scrape something off years ago. Near the back corner, a pile of old firewood had collapsed into rot. A crushed tin cup lay beside it. For a moment, Thomas imagined his uncle here, sitting by a small fire, perhaps in silence like this, surrounded by the same trees, the same cold. By the time he returned to the front, night had begun to swallow the forest. He made camp near the truck, built a small fire, and listened to the wind move through the pines. The flames reflected faintly on the container's rusted surface, making it seem alive, breathing faintly in the shifting light. He wondered what had brought his uncle to live or die so far from everything. The man had owned a modest home near town. There had been no reason to retreat into the wilderness, and certainly not to guard a box of metal in the woods. When Thomas finally lay down in his sleeping bag, he watched his dog circle twice before settling by the fire. The stars had begun to pierce through the canopy, thin and sharp as glass. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then fell silent. The air was cold enough to sting his breath, but the quiet felt deeper than discomfort. It was the quiet of something waiting to be uncovered. Before sleep took him, Thomas thought of the people who had laughed when he mentioned the inheritance. They would never come this far. They would never feel this cold or see how the firelight made the forest glow from within. They would never know that sometimes the worth of a thing isn't in what it contains, but in what it might reveal. As the flames dimmed to coals and darkness folded over him, he felt no regret for the miles behind him, only a strange certainty that he had come to the right place. By morning, frost covered the ground like ash. The fire had died, leaving a ring of white embers. Thomas rose, his breath visible in the pale dawn, and looked again at the container. In daylight it seemed smaller, less menacing, but still heavy with meaning. He brushed his hand along the rough surface, the metal cold enough to bite the skin. Somewhere inside that box lay the last message from a man who had chosen exile over compromise, silence over noise. Thomas fetched his tools from the truck, determined to open it. He told himself it was only to see what needed hauling away. But he already knew he would find more than junk. The forest had a way of keeping secrets, but it also had a way of preserving truth. As he lifted the crowbar and struck the rusted hinge for the first time, the echo rolled across the trees like a muted thunderclap, announcing that after years of stillness, Something long forgotten was about to be remembered. The sound lingered in the air, then faded into the distance, swallowed by the forest breath. The container stood silent again, but no longer indifferent. For the first time in decades, it had been touched by living hands, and with that touch began the unraveling of everything that had been buried within. The echo of the crowbar against metal still seemed to hang in the cold air the following morning. Frost glazed the grass and branches like glass, and a thin mist drifted between the trees, softening every shape into silence. Thomas rose stiffly from his sleeping bag, stoked the embers of his small fire, and brewed coffee in a dented pot while the dog stretched and shook the frost from his coat. The container loomed behind them, its surface dull red under the weak light of dawn, streaked with dew and rust. It looked less like a structure and more like a relic of another time, something forgotten by the world and claimed by the forest. He approached it with measured patience, running his hand along its corroded side as if trying to read its history through touch alone. The metal was rough, flaking, cold enough to sting. The lettering on one panel had almost vanished, but he could still make out the faint impression of numbers, perhaps from its former life, when it had once traveled the rails, carrying cargo between cities before ending up here, swallowed by moss and decades. A life that had ended the way many things ended in this part of the world, quietly. The lock refused to yield despite his effort the day before. He tried again, wedging the crowbar under the latch until, with a sudden groan that startled even Rex, the old metal gave way. The sound was deep, like the cracking of ice on a frozen lake. The doors opened slowly, resisting, as though reluctant to reveal what they had guarded all these years. A rush of stale air rolled out, thick with dust, oil, and time itself. Inside was chaos. Piles of old tires leaned against the walls, their rubber gray and brittle. Rusted barrels stood like sentinels in the shadows. The floor was buried under heaps of tangled wire, broken furniture, torn tarpaulins, shattered glass, and tools without handles. It looked like the aftermath of a storm that had gathered everything useless from a lifetime and deposited it here to rot. When Thomas's flashlight swept across the interior, the beam caught glints of metal, shards of forgotten machinery, the corner of a rotted chair. Every surface was veiled in dust, thick enough to dull even the shine of steel. He stepped inside cautiously, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. Each step stirred small clouds of dust that shimmered in the light like faint smoke. Rex hesitated at the threshold, sniffing, uneasy. To a stranger, this place would seem a ruin, nothing more than a junk heap. But to Thomas, it felt strangely deliberate, as if the disorder had been arranged with intention. Like a man trying to bury something beneath the weight of his own life. Near the front, he found remnants of familiarity. A lantern, rusted but recognizable. A pair of boots still upright, their leather cracked and stiff. A hunting jacket that might once have been green, but had turned the color of earth. In the corner, an overturned tin cup lay beside an empty thermos. He imagined his uncle there, sitting by a small fire outside the doors years ago, keeping watch over this collection of forgotten metal. But why guard junk? Why build solitude around what had no value? Thomas moved deeper inside. He tried to piece together meaning from fragments. A broken radio, a box of nails, a coil of rope, cracked jars of oil, old fishing gear, even a bicycle wheel hanging from a bent nail. It was less a storage place and more a time capsule of someone's existence, preserved not out of nostalgia, but habit. His uncle had clearly spent years accumulating, never discarding, as if unable to let go of anything that once had purpose. By midday, the sunlight filtering through the cracks in the roof had begun to shift, drawing thin gold lines through the dust. Thomas stopped to rest, leaning against a workbench half buried under junk. He wiped the sweat and dirt from his face, then looked around again. There was no order, no logic, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this chaos concealed something. The air carried the faint tang of oil and iron, the smell of machines and secrecy. He decided he would not rush. A lifetime of hunting had taught him patience, the slow, methodical way to read tracks, to follow the smallest sign until the truth revealed itself. He began clearing a path through the debris, sorting metal from wood, folding tarps, stacking boxes outside the container. Hours passed in slow rhythm. Each layer of discarded material revealed another, older one beneath it, like geological strata of a man's hidden life. There were cans of paint long hardened to stone, brittle blueprints too faded to read, and a broken pocket watch whose hands were stopped at an impossible hour. The more he uncovered, the more he began to understand that this was not simply clutter. It was memory-dense, tangible, and heavy. When he finally paused again, evening was closing in. He stood at the entrance looking out at the encroaching dusk. The container's interior had taken on a strange glow, the dying sunlight filtering through holes in the roof and scattering across the dust like faint embers. Behind him, Rex whined softly, his eyes fixed on the far end of the structure. Thomas followed the dog's gaze. There, behind a pile of twisted metal and boards, something caught the last light and reflected it back. A dull gleam, brief but unmistakable. He felt a flicker of curiosity, the same instinct that drove him through forests in pursuit of tracks barely visible in the snow. But fatigue and the approaching night held him back. The woods were beginning to fill with that peculiar soundlessness that came before darkness. When even the wind seemed to hesitate, he decided to leave it for morning. He closed the doors, this time without locking them, and walked to the small clearing where his fire still smoldered. As he sat beside the flames, eating from a can of beans and watching sparks drift upward into the blackening sky, his thoughts kept circling the same question. His uncle had lived a simple, almost ascetic life, with no sign of greed or madness. Yet this strange monument of rust and junk felt purposeful. There was something here beyond decay. Maybe it was guilt or fear or the stubbornness of a man who refused to discard the remnants of what he'd seen. The fire burned low. The cold deepened. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, and Rex lifted his head, listening. The forest around them was immense and unmoved. As if unaware that two living beings had come to disturb its long silence, Thomas looked once more at the dark shape of the container, barely visible beyond the firelight. He told himself he would empty it completely, strip it down to its walls, and learn what it was his uncle had been guarding. Before lying down, he checked the latch again. The doors were closed tight. Yet as he walked back to his bedroll, he thought he heard the faintest sound, something shifting inside, the whisper of metal settling, or perhaps something else entirely. The quiet movement of memory stirring after years of being buried. When dawn returned, the frost was thicker, the air clearer, and the decision already made. The container would be emptied to its bones. Thomas poured coffee into his cup and glanced toward the structure. The forest was still, the mist lifting in thin ribbons. Beside him, Rex stood alert, ears pricked, staring at the same far corner inside where the glint had appeared the night before. Whatever lay buried beneath that mountain of refuse was waiting for him, patient and silent as the forest itself. And Thomas, without knowing why, felt a tightening in his chest, a sense that what he was about to uncover might change everything he thought he understood about his uncle's lonely life, and perhaps about his own. He took up his gloves, stepped inside, and began again, the scrape of metal against wood echoing like a heartbeat through the stillness of the trees. The morning light crept slowly into the forest, faint and silvery, barely warming the cold air that clung to the pines. Thomas stood at the container's entrance with his hands in thick gloves, breath curling into mist. The previous day's work had only deepened the sense that what lay inside wasn't random. It wasn't a junkyard, but something layered, deliberate, almost like camouflage. His instincts, sharpened by years of tracking and observation, told him that somewhere beneath all that ruin, something had been hidden with purpose. And that thought, quiet but persistent, drove him forward more strongly than curiosity ever could. Rex moved first. The dog trotted inside, nose close to the floor, tail low but steady, moving with the confidence of a creature following a scent older than memory. Thomas watched him weave between piles of debris, pause, then push deeper into the far end of the container, where shadows pooled thick and dark. He began to clear space again, lifting rusted tools and wooden boards, each motion stirring clouds of dust that hung in the still air like smoke. The silence around him was complete, except for the occasional metallic clatter when something heavy shifted. Rex suddenly barked, a short, sharp sound that broke the stillness like the crack of a branch. Thomas froze, flashlight beam jerking toward the corner. The dog was pawing furiously at a mound of torn tarps and warped planks. There was something beneath, something solid. Thomas crossed the floor in 2 strides, pushing Rex gently aside. He began pulling away the layers, old canvas, metal scraps, pieces of rotted wood, each one revealing another beneath it until, at last, his gloved hands brushed against something cold and flat. It wasn't part of the floor. It gave slightly under pressure. He cleared the rest with his boot, revealing the edge of a box, its surface the same dull brown as the container walls. A metal chest, rectangular and heavy, capped with a corroded latch that still held firm. For a moment he simply stared at it. The craftsmanship was old, solid. It didn't belong among the junk. He dragged it into the open, grunting under the weight, and set it near the entrance where the light could reach it. Dust spiraled upward as it landed with a dull thud. Rex circled it, sniffing and whining softly. The latch resisted at first. Thomas took the crowbar, wedged it beneath the rusted edge, and pressed. With a sudden metallic crack, the lock gave way and snapped off, skittering across the floor. He hesitated before lifting the lid, an involuntary pause born from the strange gravity of the moment. The hinges creaked as if waking from a long sleep. Inside lay not the scrap he expected, but order intentional, preserved, untouched by time. The first layer was cloth, thick canvas folded neatly to line the interior. Beneath it, bundles of papers tied with twine, several small leather-bound notebooks, and a row of envelopes sealed with wax so old it had turned brittle. Everything was arranged with care, as though whoever packed the chest knew it would remain closed for years. The air that escaped smelled faintly of oil and age. Thomas lifted one of the notebooks. The leather cover was cracked but still supple, initials stamped faintly in the corner. J.G., his uncle's hand. He set the book aside and examined the rest. There were receipts, maps marked in pencil, small stacks of typed reports bearing official seals from forestry departments, or companies and county offices. He unfolded one and read the heading, Timber Harvest Authorization Restricted Zone. The dates stretched back more than 20 years. Each was signed and stamped, yet something in the paperwork felt wrong. The same signatures appeared again and again, identical down to the shape of each letter, as if copied. And besides several were notes in his uncle's handwriting, short, decisive, damning, false, counterfeit, illegal section. Thomas leaned back, stunned. His uncle hadn't been hoarding trash. He had been collecting proof records of illegal logging, falsified permits, documents that could destroy reputations and companies. This chest was an archive of guilt hidden beneath a mountain of garbage that no one would bother to touch. His respect for the old man deepened into something else, admiration mixed with unease. It was the kind of evidence people risked their lives to hide or expose. He continued to sift through the contents. Among the papers were photographs, grainy black and white shots of logging sites, men standing beside piles of timber stamped with government numbers. On the back of one photo, his uncle had written a date and a single word, proof. Another image showed a line of trucks carrying illegal loads through a checkpoint under the cover of night. Thomas could almost hear his uncle's calm, patient voice describing the betrayal of the land he had sworn to protect. Beneath the folders lay something heavier, a sealed metal tin. Its lid was secured by 2 rusted clips. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, was a small collection of personal items, his uncle's compass, an old lighter engraved with the initials J.G., a pocket knife dulled by use, and a single photograph folded carefully to protect it from moisture. Thomas unfolded it with trembling fingers. The picture showed his uncle standing beside a younger man, both wearing forestry uniforms, the background a stretch of clear-cut hillside. The younger man's face was faintly familiar. He had seen it once in the county office, framed above a certificate. The former head of the Timber Commission, long retired and long respected. As the implications settled in, the forest outside seemed to grow quieter, as though even the trees were listening. His uncle had discovered a network of corruption that stretched deep into the county's past, and somewhere along the way, he must have realized that revealing it would cost him everything, so he had hidden it here, where greed and laziness would protect it better than any lock. Thomas set the photograph aside and opened one of the leather notebooks. The handwriting inside was precise, deliberate. It detailed inspection dates, the locations of hidden cut sites, the names of contractors, and the amounts paid under the table. The entries grew darker toward the end, the words tighter, the lines shakier. One final page carried only a single note. If they find this, they will silence me. The truth stays buried here. For a long time, Thomas sat in the cold air of the container, notebook open on his knees, the dog resting beside him. He understood now that this was not just his uncle's past. It was an inheritance of responsibility. The old man had spent his last years gathering the truth and protecting it, trusting that someday, somehow, it might be found by someone who would do what he could not. Outside, the sky had turned the pale blue of late afternoon. Thomas packed the documents back into the chest with the same care they had been kept, then closed the lid. He would take it with him, study it, understand it fully before deciding what to do. As he stepped out into the fading light, he noticed again how utterly alone they were. The road back to town was nearly 40 miles of unmarked dirt and silence. No one knew he was here. No one would know what he had found. He loaded the chest into the truck's bed, covering it with a tarp. When he turned back, the container stood open and empty, its contents stripped away, its mystery revealed. It looked different now. Less menacing, almost peaceful, as if it had finally released its secret. That night, as he drove back through the forest, the headlights sliced through mist and shadow. The dog slept curled on the seat beside him, exhausted from the long day. The road wound endlessly, and in that isolation, Thomas felt a weight settling on his shoulders, not just the burden of what he carried, but the certainty that the discovery had tied his life to his uncle's unfinished story. When he finally reached his cabin, the stars had already filled the sky, bright and cold. He parked the truck and sat in silence, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The chest in the back was invisible under its tarp, but he could feel its presence, heavy and undeniable. Somewhere within those papers lay names and truths that could shake everything he thought he knew about the quiet county he called home. He looked at his reflection in the dark window, seeing in himself something of the man who had come before, a stubbornness, a refusal to turn away from what others preferred to ignore. Perhaps this too was part of the inheritance. Not the metal box or the land it sat on, but the conviction to confront what was hidden, no matter how deep it lay. Inside, he lit the stove and watched the flames catch. The warmth filled the room slowly, pushing back the chill that had followed him from the forest. Rex lay near the door, sighing in his sleep. Thomas sat at the table, notebook in hand, and began to read his uncle's words again. Outside, the wind rose, whispering against the windows like distant voices. The truth was no longer buried. It was here, waiting, and with it came the quiet promise of consequence. The storm arrived just before dawn, rolling through the forest with a sound like distant artillery. Rain lashed the roof of the cabin, and the wind pressed against the windows, forcing water through the cracks in thin, glittering threads. Thomas woke early, the dog stirring beside him, and for a moment he lay still, listening to the storm's rhythm against the walls. The metal chest sat in the corner, its surface slick with condensation, like something alive that had been dredged up from the earth. Every few minutes a gust rattled the window panes, and the cabin creaked in answer. He rose, lit the stove, and poured black coffee into a chipped enamel mug. Outside, the forest was half erased by fog, the trees nothing but gray silhouettes swaying in the wind. The world felt suspended, caught between sleep and wakefulness, and in that silence he turned again to the notebooks. The first pages had been cautious, factual, methodical lists of dates and coordinates, shipments and inspections. But deeper into the pages, the handwriting began to change. The lines grew tighter, more urgent, words pressed into the paper as if carved. Each entry drew him further into his uncle's private war. There were descriptions of logging convoys that moved at night, of government trucks filled with unmarked timber, of new roads cut illegally through protected land. He wrote about corporate men who arrived in black sedans, who spoke in polite voices while handing over sealed envelopes. He wrote of warnings, of visits, of letters left unsigned on his doorstep. The tone of the writing was calm, factual, and yet every sentence carried the weight of a man who knew he was being watched. Thomas paused often, staring into the fire while the rain hammered outside. He imagined his uncle sitting in this same silence years ago, wrestling with the same questions. How do you fight something too large to touch? How do you expose corruption when every path toward truth is guarded by those who profit from lies? The forest, he realized, had not been his uncle's retreat. It had been his refuge, the last ground left to him when the world turned hostile. By midday, the storm had eased. The dog paced restlessly, whining near the door, sensing his master's unease. Thomas set the notebooks aside and stepped out onto the porch. The rain had washed the earth clean, leaving the air sharp and cold. The road beyond his gate was empty, but he knew how quickly isolation could turn from safety to danger. If the wrong person learned what he now held in his cabin, there would be no hiding. He spent the next hours sorting through the documents more carefully, arranging them into piles. The map showed a pattern, cut zones expanding deeper into restricted territory, each approved by signatures that appeared on the forged permits. The same names repeated in the reports, the same initials that matched those on the photograph from the chest. The evidence was irrefutable. The men who had destroyed the protected forest had also built their lives and reputations upon it. And among those names, one stood out. Samuel Hart, the current mayor of the county and a man known publicly as a benefactor of conservation projects. His name appeared again and again, often beside that of the former head of the Timber Commission, the same younger man from the photograph. The truth was no longer a puzzle. It was a structure built from greed and silence, and his uncle had mapped it down to the smallest beam. Thomas felt a slow, heavy anger grow in him as he read. The injustice was not abstract, it was personal. This forest, the one surrounding his home and his uncle's land, had been carved open by these same men. The ruins of illegal clearings, the absence of the oldest trees, he had seen them for years without understanding what had caused them. Toward evening, he found a final entry in the last notebook, written in uneven script. The ink was faintly smeared, as if by a trembling hand. They came again last night. I heard them outside speaking low near the tree line. I have hidden the evidence in the container. If I am gone, let the truth find the light. If they silence me, let someone else finish what I began. The date below it was the same week the authorities had declared John Gray missing before eventually marking him as deceased. Thomas closed the book and sat motionless for a long time. The fire had burned down to coals, filling the room with a dim orange glow. Outside, twilight was settling over the forest, the light thinning between the branches. He could feel the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. It wasn't just proof of corruption, it was the echo of a man's final days, a record of his courage and his fear. He rose and began to gather the most important documents into a satchel. He knew what had to come next. The evidence needed to reach someone who could act, someone beyond the reach of the men whose names filled those pages. But that decision carried risk. There was no guarantee of protection, no certainty that the truth would survive once it left his hands. Yet he could not keep it hidden. His uncle's life had already been the cost of silence. The next morning he drove to town. The journey felt longer than before, each mile carrying him farther from solitude and deeper into consequence. He arrived with a satchel under his arm and stopped before the small local newspaper office that sat on the edge of Main Street, its windows dim and uninviting. Inside, the editor, a tired man in his 50s, barely looked up when Thomas entered. When Thomas placed the satchel on his desk and told him what it contained, the man's expression shifted from irritation to disbelief, then to cautious curiosity. By the time the first few documents were examined, the editor's hands had begun to shake. He called in a younger reporter from the back room, a man with restless eyes and a notebook always at hand. The reporter asked questions, carefully, testing Thomas's resolve, measuring the weight of what lay before them. By the end of the hour, both men understood that this was more than a local scandal. It was a chain of crimes that could reach the state capitol, perhaps even higher. They agreed to verify everything before publication, to contact lawyers and cross-check signatures. Thomas left the office with mixed relief and dread. He knew what would follow. The storm his uncle had feared was coming again, Only this time, it would reach beyond the forest. Back at the cabin, the forest greeted him with its familiar stillness, but it no longer felt like shelter. He moved the remaining papers into a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, a habit learned from years of caution in the wilderness. That night, he kept the lights dim, the doors locked, and his rifle within reach. Rex slept near the bed, twitching occasionally in his dreams, unaware that his master's thoughts were far from rest. When the first call came from the newspaper 2 days later, it was not about progress, but warning. The reporter spoke quickly, voice low and strained. Word had spread. Someone in the county office had been asking questions, tracing the documents, trying to find their source. Cars had been seen near the paper's back alley late at night. The reporter told him to stay put, to keep safe, to wait until the story was printed and the evidence was secure. After the call, Thomas stood at the window, looking out over the dark woods. The wind moved softly through the trees, the same forest his uncle had once protected. He realized that everything had begun here and would likely end here as well. The difference was that now, the truth was awake, no longer buried in rust and silence. It had a voice again. He poured himself another cup of coffee and watched the first light of dawn rise behind the pines. The storm had passed, but in its wake came a deeper quiet, the kind that settles before something breaks. He knew they would come for him, just as they had come for his uncle. And yet as he stood there, steady and unafraid, he felt the strange calm of a man who has already made peace with what must be done. The newspaper printed the first article 3 days later. It appeared quietly on a Wednesday morning, a modest column on the front page of a local paper that most people read over coffee and discarded before work. Yet by noon, the story had already begun to spread beyond the town's borders. Names were mentioned, men who had built careers and fortunes under the guise of progress, officials who had signed illegal permits, companies that had stripped protected land for profit. The documents Thomas had found in his uncle's chest were cited as sources. At the bottom of the article was a single line that changed everything. Evidence provided by local resident and hunter Thomas Gray, heir of the late forest warden John Gray. The phone in his cabin began to ring before the sun had fully risen. At first, it was reporters asking for statements, their voices polite but insistent. Then came calls that were less friendly, anonymous, heavy with warning. By afternoon, the phone was silent again, the line dead. When Thomas stepped outside, he saw tire marks near his gate that hadn't been there the night before. The air was unnaturally still, the forest holding its breath as if it sensed what was coming. He went about his routine as best he could, though everything had changed. The woods that once offered peace now seemed full of unseen eyes. Rex stayed close to him, never straying far from the porch, ears pricked and muscles tense. At night, Thomas sat by the window with the lights off, watching the dirt road vanish into the darkness. More than once, he caught the faint gleam of headlights pausing at a distance before retreating into the trees. The following days blurred together. The second article appeared on Friday, this one in a regional paper. It contained photographs from the documents, reproductions of permits and signatures, and an image of his uncle's handwritten notes. The journalist who had taken the risk to publish them called Thomas that evening, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. He said the evidence had already been sent to a larger publication, that more reporters were asking questions, that lawyers were getting involved. The story was too big to bury now, but the warning came soon after. Someone had broken into the newspaper's office the previous night. Files were stolen, computers smashed, and the young reporter was attacked while leaving the building. He was alive but shaken, hiding out in another town. He told Thomas not to return to the city, not to answer any unknown calls. "They know who you are," he said quietly before hanging up. The weight of those words settled over Thomas like a winter fog. He locked his doors, checked his rifle, and placed the remaining documents copies of everything inside a waterproof case hidden beneath the cabin floor. He burned nothing. His uncle had died trying to protect the truth, and Thomas would not destroy it now. On the third night, the first real act of intimidation came. He woke to the sharp scent of smoke and the crackle of flames. Through the window, he saw the orange glow behind the trees, his old storage shed engulfed in fire. He grabbed his rifle, burst out into the cold, and shouted into the darkness, but there was no answer. The fire roared high, consuming dry timber and tools alike. Rex barked furiously beside him, the dog's silhouette flickering in the light. When it was over, only blackened beams remained. Whoever had done it was long gone, leaving nothing but silence and the faint smell of gasoline. The sheriff arrived the next morning, summoned by a neighbor who had seen the smoke from miles away. His questions were brief, his tone distant. He called it an unfortunate accident, scribbled a few words into his notepad, and drove away without ever looking Thomas in the eye. That was when Thomas understood that the rot his uncle had uncovered ran deeper than he'd imagined. The men whose names filled those documents were not merely corrupt, they were powerful, and their influence reached into every corner of this county. Later that week, Rex disappeared. It happened in the early evening, just after sunset. The dog had been lying on the porch as usual when he suddenly lifted his head, growled, and bolted into the woods. Thomas heard the barking fade, then stop entirely. He called out until his voice broke, searching with a flashlight deep into the forest, but there was no trace. For 2 days he scoured every trail, every hollow. On the third morning, Rex limped back into the clearing, his flank cut, fur matted with dried blood. He collapsed at Thomas's feet, exhausted but alive. The message was clear. This was no warning anymore. It was a line drawn. Something hardened in Thomas that day. Fear gave way to resolve. He had always lived by a simple code: face what hunts you, never run from it. Now that same instinct returned, colder and sharper than ever. He cleaned his rifle, packed a small bag, and made the decision to drive back into town, not to plead, not to hide, but to ensure the story would reach beyond their reach. The trip was quiet, too quiet. He arrived just before dusk and went straight to the newspaper office. The place was half empty, its windows boarded from the break-in. The editor greeted him with a grim smile, eyes red from lack of sleep. "They're scared," he said simply. "But they won't stop it now. The files are already copied and sent to every major paper in the state. Even if they shut us down, it's out there." Thomas nodded. He left the satchel of additional papers, duplicates of the ones he had hidden at home, and shook the man's hand. When he stepped back into the street, the sky was the color of ash. Somewhere a bell rang, and the wind carried the scent of rain. He drove home slowly, headlights carving narrow tunnels through the darkness. The feeling that he was being followed never left him, but he refused to turn around. When he reached the cabin, the night was quiet again. Too quiet. The forest no longer felt like a refuge. Its silence was the silence before something breaks. He fed Rex, checked his doors, and sat by the fire, listening to the logs crackle. The radio, left on the counter, hissed faintly with static before a voice broke through. News from the city, reports of arrests, of officials questioned, of companies under investigation. The work had begun. His uncle's truth was no longer buried in rust and dust. He didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind outside felt significant. Just before dawn, he stepped onto the porch and looked toward the faint line of smoke still visible where his shed had burned. The earth was cold beneath his feet, but the horizon was beginning to lighten. When the first bird started to call, he realized that something inside him had shifted completely. He was no longer the quiet hunter who had once wanted only solitude. He had become the keeper of a promise made by another man long dead. The world had turned its eyes, at least for a moment, toward this forgotten stretch of forest, and he would make sure it did not look away again. As the sun rose over the trees, Thomas knew the storm was far from over. The men who had thrived on silence would not accept defeat easily, but the truth was free now, alive in the words printed and shared beyond their reach. And if they came for him, as they surely would, he would meet them not with fear, but with the same quiet strength his uncle had carried until the end. The fire had taken his shed, the threats had scarred his nights, but they could not reclaim what had already been set in motion. The forest, once wounded, was beginning to breathe again, and in its low whisper of dawn, he heard something that sounded like gratitude. By the time the sun climbed above the ridge that bordered the northern forest, the story had already reached national headlines. The photographs of his uncle's documents appeared on news sites across the country. Interviews with environmental experts filled the radio. Senators were calling for investigations. In every broadcast, one image reappeared: the rusted container standing silent among the pines. the place where truth had slept for decades. They called it the Gray Discovery, though Thomas would have given anything to avoid his name being attached to it. He spent that morning sitting on the porch, the radio murmuring beside him while the wind stirred through the wet grass. Rex lay nearby, healed but still limping slightly from the wound that had nearly ended him. The air carried the smell of pine and smoke, a mix of ruin and renewal. Thomas listened to the news without joy. Every victory felt distant, diluted by the cost that had come before it. His uncle was gone, the past had been exhumed, and the world had finally taken notice. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished. By afternoon, 2 black sedans appeared on the road leading to his property. For a moment, his heart froze. He reached for the rifle resting beside the door, but when the men stepped out, he saw government emblems on their jackets. Federal agents. Their voices were calm, respectful. They asked for the remaining evidence, promising protection, safety, a formal investigation. Thomas hesitated, measuring them with the same instinct that had kept him alive through long hunts and longer winters. These men didn't move like the ones who came in the night. They carried themselves with purpose, not menace. After a long pause, he went to the cellar and returned with the waterproof case. They thanked him, handed him a document to sign, and told him to expect further contact. Before leaving, one of the agents looked at the dog and said softly, "You're lucky to have found what he left behind." Thomas didn't answer. He watched the vehicles disappear down the road, their dust trails fading into the trees. When the sound of engines died, silence returned, a silence so deep it seemed almost reverent. In the following weeks, the investigations grew louder. More officials were named, more arrests made. The mayor resigned, the timber company suspended operations, and public outrage swelled. Environmental organizations descended on the county, offering funds to restore the damaged forest. New boundaries were drawn around the protected land. New laws drafted to prevent such crimes from repeating. The forest that had once been a battlefield of greed was slowly reclaiming its peace. Yet for Thomas, peace remained elusive. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge but a memorial. Each corner held echoes of his uncle, the handwriting in the margins of notebooks, the smell of oil on old tools, the way sunlight cut through the dust in late afternoon. He had fulfilled the old man's unfinished task, yet the satisfaction he'd imagined never came. Some nights he walked down to the container, now cleaned and empty, its floor swept and its purpose fulfilled. Standing there, he would imagine his uncle hunched over papers, working in secret by the light of a single lamp, his mind already decades ahead of his time. It was here he realized that a man's isolation had become the world's inheritance. Then came the invitation, a letter embossed with a government seal, delivered by courier. They wanted him to speak at a congressional hearing in the Capitol. A public testimony about what he'd found, a chance to put the final stone on his uncle's story. Thomas read it several times before setting it aside. The idea of traveling to a city, standing before cameras and officials, felt unbearable. He had never sought attention, never asked to be part of history, and yet deep down, he knew that refusing would mean allowing others to define the narrative for him. A week later, dressed in his only clean jacket, he stepped off a train into a world of marble and glass. The Capitol was everything his forest was not: crowded, loud, restless. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, shouting questions, their flashes cutting through the morning light. Inside, the air smelled of polish and authority. He spoke simply, describing what he had found, how his uncle had gathered the evidence, and how those who profited from destruction had tried to erase him. There was no drama in his words, no embellishment, only the quiet conviction of a man who had seen too much and lost enough to understand the value of truth. When the hearing ended, a senator approached him privately. She told him the investigation had already expanded to several states, that his uncle's work had uncovered patterns no one had dared to examine. "You did the right thing," she said gently. "You've given this country back a piece of its conscience." Thomas nodded but said nothing. The praise felt hollow. He hadn't done it for conscience or justice. He had done it because silence had already cost too much. He returned home to a forest that was changing. The cleanup crews had left, and the first green shoots were beginning to break through the scorched soil near the remains of the burned shed. New saplings lined the old clearings. Birds had returned in greater numbers. their songs threading through the morning air. Even the container, once an emblem of secrecy, now stood open to the elements, its rust catching the sunlight like bronze. One evening, as twilight settled between the trees, a vehicle pulled up to the gate. It was the young reporter who had nearly been killed for printing the story. He looked tired but alive, his notebook still in his pocket. He told Thomas the newspaper had won an award for investigative reporting and that he wanted to give the credit to the man who had made it possible. Thomas shook his head and smiled faintly. It was never about credit, he said, just about setting things right. The reporter stayed for coffee, and together they watched the darkness fall, the sound of owls echoing through the trees. As the weeks turned into months, the noise of the outside world began to fade again. The story moved on, as all stories eventually do. Politicians debated new policies, corporations issued statements of regret, and the headlines shifted to other crises. But the forest remained. It grew thicker, wilder, more alive with every passing season. Thomas rebuilt his shed, though smaller this time, and used it to store tools for planting and fencing rather than for hunting. He had found a new purpose in care rather than pursuit. One morning he followed Rex down the familiar trail behind the cabin, the same path his uncle must have walked countless times. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of earth after rain. When they reached the clearing, the container stood quietly in the sunlight, its metal surface streaked with age but no longer menacing. On impulse, Thomas placed his hand on its side. The metal was warm. He felt a strange peace, a sense that the circle had closed, that both he and the land had been forgiven for what they had endured. That night, sitting by the fire, he opened one of the remaining notebooks. The last page was blank except for a single line written in his uncle's small, careful hand. "If one day the forest speaks again, listen." Thomas smiled at that, not sadly but with quiet understanding. The forest was speaking now in birdsong, in wind, in the creak of new growth rising where destruction had once reigned. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stepped outside. The stars hung clear and cold above the treetops, the world vast and calm. For the first time in years, he felt the burden lift completely. His uncle's war was over. The truth had done its work, and the land was healing. He stood there for a long while, the firelight behind him and the whispering forest before him, knowing that some battles end not in victory or defeat, but in quiet restoration. The rusted container, the old cabin, the silent trees, all of it was part of one story, one inheritance. And as the wind rose, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain, Thomas closed his eyes and listened. The forest spoke, and he, at last, understood. If this story kept you watching till the end, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on the bell. The next one will take you even deeper. Don't miss it. And if you felt something while watching, share this video with someone who needs to see it too.